The wind that morning carried the sharp scent of autumn-dry cornfields rustling like whispered secrets along the edge of Greenfield, Indiana. Parents had walked their kids to school that day with an uneasy hush. It was mid-September of 2001, only days after the attacks that changed everything in America. People felt raw and vulnerable, and there was this collective promise to hold family tighter. Meadowbrook Elementary sat at the edge of town with its pale brick walls and chain-link fences that had never felt necessary before. Children laughed nervously, teachers huddled with coffee mugs in the staff room, trying to pretend everything was normal. Yet even in that solemn climate, recess was a ritual no one dared deny. That day the playground was buzzing with cautious laughter. The ball courts were full. The swings creaked in rhythm, and Madison Kramer ran along the fence line in a bright blue hoodie that would later be the center of every missing child flyer. Her mother, Denise, had braided her hair that morning, tucking the last strand with deliberate care. She told Madison to be kind to her friends, to listen to the teacher, to stay away from the fence line when the older boys played kickball there. Madison nodded as she always did, her eyes darting to the red ball she wanted to chase. Denise remembered pressing her palm to Madison's cheek, telling her that no matter how scary the world felt, she would always come home. Madison had smiled the small gap in her teeth, making her look even younger. Then she was gone, skipping down the walkway to school, her backpack bouncing behind her. Denise had stood at the door, watching her fade into the fall mist, an image she would play back hundreds of times in her head in the years to come. Every parent knows that feeling of vulnerability, but for Denise, it would become a lifelong prison. At Meadowbrook, the first bell rang as usual. Madison sat in her second-grade classroom, tapping her pencil against her notebook, her mind on the playground. The teacher read from a battered social studies book, her voice calm, despite the tension hanging over the country. Kids fidgeted and whispered about Osama bin Laden, about planes and New York City, their understanding fragmentary and terrifying. Madison did not really care about that. She wanted recess. When the bell finally rang again and the teacher told them to line up, Madison was first out the door. She sprinted ahead of her friends, the grass damp under her sneakers. They chased one another in loose circles, grabbing at jackets, screaming in shrill delight. She found the red rubber ball just as she planned and kicked it as hard as she could. It soared in a perfect arc toward the old fence, rattling against the metal. Her friends cheered, but she did not wait. She ran after it, breath clouding in the chill air. On the far side of the playground, the fence line separated the school grounds from a small, wooded lot that had once been farmland. Teachers did not usually worry about it because it was overgrown and littered with thorn bushes. But there was a small break in the fence where kids liked to slip through when no one watched. Madison's friend Emily would later say she saw Madison push through that break, the ball bouncing ahead into the leaves. Emily would tell the police she called out to Madison to come back, that the teacher was blowing the whistle. Madison turned once, hair falling in her eyes, and waved. Then she disappeared behind the tree line. Emily ran back to the main yard when the whistle blew again. No one saw Madison come back. No one noticed she was gone until they were all lined up, breathless and muddy, waiting for the teacher to count heads. The teacher, a woman named Mrs. Glendon, did not panic at first. She was used to kids dawdling. She called Madison's name twice, scanning the yard, thinking she would pop out from behind the slide or the old oak stump. When Madison did not appear, she handed the rest of the class to the aide and began searching. She walked along the fence line, pushing aside branches. She did not see the gap in the wire at first. When she did, her heart thudded painfully. She squeezed through and called Madison's name, but the woods were silent except for the wind rattling dry leaves. She ran back to the main yard, blowing her own whistle in 3 sharp blasts. The aide came running. Within minutes, the principal was on the radio to the front office, and someone was calling 911. The first police car pulled up with lights flashing, but no siren. Officer Daniels stepped out, his face grave. He had kids at this school. He spoke quietly to the principal, took down details, and asked the teachers to gather the students in the cafeteria. Madison's name was called over the loudspeaker. No answer. They locked the building as a precaution, even though they had no idea what they were facing. Parents who heard the news on scanners began arriving early, their faces pale. Denise was working the register at the local grocery store when she got the call. Her manager said she dropped the scanner on the floor, sprinted to her car without even grabbing her coat. She would never remember that drive, only the trembling in her fingers on the wheel. When Denise arrived, there were already police cars around the school officers, fanning out with radios crackling. She ran up to the front entrance and was stopped by an officer who took one look at her face and knew who she was. He led her inside, gently, his hand on her back, as if steadying her for a blow. In the office, the principal tried to explain what they knew. Madison had gone missing during recess. No one had seen her come back. They had already searched the yard. Now they were searching the woods. Denise felt the room tilting, her vision narrowing, until all she saw was her daughter's face that morning, bright and eager, full of life. She tried to stand, but fell back into the chair, sobbing. Officers reassured her they would find Madison, that maybe she had just wandered further than they expected, that kids got scared and hid sometimes. But no one really believed that. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the chain-link fence like a warning. Teachers and aides were crying quietly behind the gym. The playground was deserted, except for the abandoned ball near the fence line. Yellow police tape fluttered, marking off the gap in the wire. The principal spoke in hushed tones to the police chief. They both glanced at the woods, dark and tangled, as if they were staring into the mouth of something monstrous. That afternoon, helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping the sky. Volunteers gathered at the firehouse, forming lines to search the fields. Reporters began to arrive, filming live for the evening news. The headline was simple but devastating. Missing child, search underway. Community in shock. Denise sat on the floor of the principal's office, clutching Madison's backpack. The zipper was stuck, the cartoon keychain dangling at an odd angle. She rocked back and forth, whispering her daughter's name over and over. Outside, flashlights flickered. In the gathering dusk, voices called Madison's name. Dogs. Barked engines idled, waiting to take searchers deeper into the fields. The town of Greenfield, Indiana would never be the same again. That day marked the end of its illusion of safety. Even as parents hugged their children tighter that night, they understood something precious had been ripped away. And in the middle of it all sat Denise alone, with her terror, her grief just beginning. The next morning broke cold and gray, with mist hugging the fields around Greenfield like a damp blanket. Police cruisers lined the street outside Meadowbrook Elementary. Their headlights cut through the gloom as officers gathered for a briefing, voices low and urgent. Inside the school, teachers sat slumped at desks, their eyes red from crying. Parents lingered in the hallways, demanding updates, clutching their children's shoulders so tightly. The kids winced. Officer Daniels paced the front lobby with a notebook in his hand. He asked every adult who had been on duty the day before about what they had seen. Teachers offered fragments of memory. Madison running toward the fence, Emily calling her back. Nothing that explained how an 8-year-old could vanish in broad daylight. Sheriff Harris stood outside the main entrance, arms crossed over his heavy jacket, watching volunteers spill into the fields. Men in work boots and women in old sneakers moved in staggered lines, calling Madison's name over and over. Search dogs barked, yanking their leashes to get at fresh scents that turned out to be nothing. Helicopters circled low, ruffling the dry cornstalks. Denise Kramer wandered the search site like a ghost, her face ashen, her eyes fixed on the tree line. Deputies tried to comfort her, telling her to stay back for her own safety, but she shook them off and kept walking. Carl Kramer arrived late, his face flushed, hair uncombed. He claimed he had driven all night from the factory out of state, where he had been picking up extra shifts. His voice cracked as he asked the sheriff what was being done. By noon, the media had arrived in force. Vans with satellite dishes parked along Main Street. Reporters angled for shots of the police tape fluttering along the playground fence. Denise sat on a folding chair someone had brought, her arms wrapped tight around Madison's backpack. She refused food and water, mumbling that she could not eat while her daughter was out there somewhere. Carl hovered nearby, trying to talk to her. but she would not look at him. A reporter tried to ask her questions, but Officer Daniels stepped in, blocking the camera lens with one big hand. Deputies handed out maps to searchers, marking the spots already combed. They expanded the radius from the school grounds to the surrounding woods and fields, dragging poles through brambles and overturning logs. Investigators interviewed the children in Madison's class one by one in the principal's office. Emily trembled as she described seeing Madison slip through the fence. Other kids admitted they had seen her run after the ball, but no one had followed. One boy claimed he had seen a green pickup truck parked by the back fence, idling with its lights off. But when asked for details, he just shrugged, saying it might have been someone's parent. The police took that lead seriously, sending out alerts to patrols and asking locals if they recognized the description. Nothing came back. The security cameras at the school were useless, the office admitting they had been out of order for weeks, the repair pushed back due to budget cuts. The sheriff cursed when he heard that telling his men it meant they were blind. As the sun began to set again on the second day, the search took on an air of grim routine. Volunteers slogged back to the firehouse, shivering with sweat drying on their shirts. Police wrote up their reports with tired eyes, trying to make sense of contradictory statements. Denise refused to leave. She sat by the edge of the woods, her fingers digging into the damp earth. Carl knelt beside her, murmuring that they needed to go home and rest. She ignored him until finally 2 deputies coaxed her into their cruiser to drive her back to the small, green house she refused to abandon. That night, the local news ran a special segment. The anchor read from the teleprompter with practiced solemnity, describing Madison's bright smile, her missing tooth, the blue hoodie with a flower patch on the shoulder. Viewers sat at dinner tables in stunned silence, children peeking over plates, listening as the adults shook their heads. The third day brought in state investigators with crisp jackets and tired faces. They set up a command post in the school's music room, spreading maps and checklists across desks meant for 8-year-olds. Officers from neighboring counties joined the search, pushing deeper into the woods, checking old wells crawling under bridges. The dogs picked up scents that faded into nothing. Helicopters used infrared, but the autumn chill and dense foliage betrayed no body heat. Deputies knocked on every door in Greenfield, showing Madison's picture to anyone who would look. They found no one who had seen her after the moment she stepped through that fence. The green pickup became a focus, but no one could remember its license plate, or even the exact model. Suspicion festered quietly, everyone wondering if it was a stranger or someone local. Carl was questioned formally that evening. He sat in the station conference room, fingers drumming on the table. He insisted he had been out of state, bringing his timesheet and gas receipts as proof. The investigators nodded but kept writing. They asked about the state of his marriage, about arguments with Madison. He cursed, saying he was not perfect, but he would never hurt his little girl. Meanwhile, Denise sat in her living room, staring at the TV on mute, watching the loop of Madison's picture fade in and out with the emergency alert. Emily's parents called to check on her. She had nightmares, waking up screaming that Madison was calling for her from the trees. By the end of the first week, the search was national news. CNN ran the story in the crawl, under footage of Ground Zero pairing America's collective grief with Greenfield's private one. The sheriff went on camera, voice shaking, asking whoever took Madison to please let her go. Denise recorded a plea at the firehouse, her voice hollow. She begged for her baby back, saying she would forgive anything if they just brought her home. The town gathered at the local church, candles guttering in the cold wind as parents clutched their children. Police cars roamed the streets all night, lights flashing, officers shining spotlights into darkened fields. Greenfield felt like a town under siege, and all the while, the woods along the fence line loomed silent and indifferent. The town of Greenfield settled into a restless unease in the weeks following Madison's disappearance. School reopened with new rules about sticking to assigned areas and never approaching the fence, but the children had grown quiet and watchful. Teachers spoke in hushed tones about therapy sessions offered in the gym, while parents lingered at pickup arms folded tightly as they scanned the yard for danger. Denise Kramer rarely left her house except to pace the yard or glare at the news vans that still parked at the curb hoping for an interview. She refused to speak to them, now the anger in her eyes enough to send even the boldest reporter back to their car. Carl Kramer slept on the couch most nights, a blanket thrown over his legs, beer bottles collecting on the floor. Their once neat home had become a monument to loss. Curtains drawn, tight dishes stacked in the sink. The sheriff's department continued to work the case, but the leads dried up like the autumn fields. They revisited the story of the green pickup, showing sketches to truck stops and gas stations across the county, but nothing solid emerged. The town began to murmur suspicion, taking root in the silence. People whispered in grocery aisles and at the post office, wondering if it had really been a stranger or if something darker was at play. A clerk remembered Carl shouting at Denise once in the store, his voice cracking with rage as she wiped tears from her eyes. A neighbor said she had heard the family dog barking wildly the night before Madison disappeared, a frantic series of barks that had gone on for minutes before stopping abruptly. The police took notes, but nothing conclusive came of it. Denise started to avoid everyone, ignoring the casseroles left on her porch, refusing offers to attend prayer circles at the church. She sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the photos taped to the refrigerator. There was one of Madison at age 6. 2 missing teeth in her grin, arms outstretched toward the camera. Denise traced the edges of that photo with one finger until the paper grew soft. She refused to change the bedsheets in Madison's room or pack away her toys. At night, she would open the door and sit on the edge of the little pink bed, pressing a pillow to her chest, as if it were her daughter. Outside, the yard became overgrown with weeds. The mailbox leaned at an angle, paint peeling. The house seemed to shrink in on itself, a physical marker of grief that no one could miss. Carl, on the other hand, tried to stay busy. He took odd jobs when he could find them, working construction or hauling scrap. He spoke less and less to Denise, their exchanges clipped and bitter. Once a neighbor overheard them screaming at each other through open windows. Denise's voice cracked as she accused him of failing to protect Madison. Carl shouted back that she was supposed to be watching their daughter, that he had been at work trying to pay the bills. The words tumbled out like accusations neither could take back. Police were called once for a welfare check after someone reported hearing things breaking inside, but no charges were filed. The officers left with a warning and a knowing look, shaking their heads as they returned to their cruisers. Local gossip soon turned cruel. Some said Carl had a temper. An old arrest from years back for domestic battery surfaced. The charge eventually dropped, but the whispers stuck. Others blamed Denise for being too distracted, too friendly with everyone at church, even too trusting of the older kids in the neighborhood. It seemed everyone needed someone to blame to make sense of the horror. The school tried to move on, replacing the broken fence, tightening security. But no one felt truly safe. Parents signed out their kids for lunch instead of letting them stay in the cafeteria. Teachers watched the clock during recess with their eyes glued to the playground. Madison's empty desk was eventually removed, but the space where it had sat seemed to glow with awful significance. By Thanksgiving, the Kramers had stopped attending church services altogether. Denise claimed she could not face the prayers offered in their direction, could not stand the pitying looks from people who had once called her a friend. Carl would show up drunk at the local bar and pick fights with anyone who mentioned his daughter's name, once getting thrown out for smashing a glass against the floor. Meanwhile, volunteers who had combed the fields felt ashamed that they had failed. The search parties no longer met in the firehouse, their tables cleared of maps and water bottles. Madison's missing posters began to curl at the edges, rain-stained and faded, but no one had the heart to take them down. One teacher confessed privately to a detective that she had seen Madison arguing with an older boy a week before she disappeared. She had thought it was playground nonsense, nothing worth reporting. When pressed for a description, she faltered, realizing she could not even recall what the boy had been wearing. The lead went nowhere, but it left a bitter taste in the investigator's mouth. They added the detail to the growing file of things they wished they had known in time. In town meetings, the sheriff gave updates with carefully chosen words, his expression grave. He explained that they were still investigating every tip, that the case was not closed. Yet people left those meetings with hunched shoulders, shaking their heads. It was as if Greenfield had accepted that Madison was gone forever, an unspeakable wound they all shared. As the months passed, the energy around Madison's case seemed to seep away like water through cracked soil. Winter arrived in Greenfield with biting winds and gray skies, pushing people indoors and quieting the chatter about what had happened. The flyers stapled to telephone poles faded and tore in the freezing rain, the color photos of Madison's smile bleached to ghostly outlines. The sheriff's department kept a slim folder on their desks, but new emergencies took priority. Accidents on icy roads, domestic calls on holiday nights. The search for Madison slipped into the background, a grim fixture everyone tried to ignore. Denise stopped answering the phone when reporters called her voice too raw to speak. She spent entire days in Madison's room tracing shapes on the walls, with her fingertip whispering lullabies into the empty air. Carl threw himself into work when he could find it, taking long-haul trucking jobs that kept him away for weeks. He preferred the roar of the engine and the lonely highways to the suffocating silence of their house. When he came home, he found Denise unwashed and brittle with grief. They barely spoke, except to fight the blame hanging heavy in every sentence. One night she screamed that he must have known something, that no one just vanishes without a trace. He roared back that she had failed their daughter by letting her run free, by ignoring her, by pretending everything was fine. Their neighbors heard the shouting through the thin walls and turned off their porch lights, not wanting to get involved. The police still took tips when they came in, but most led nowhere. A gas station owner in Illinois called in a sighting, swearing a girl with Madison's gap-toothed grin had bought candy there with an older man. Detectives rushed over, pulling grainy security footage that turned out to be another child entirely. Each false lead crushed Denise a little more, convincing her she would never see her daughter again. Volunteers who had once walked shoulder to shoulder through cornfields now avoided her at the grocery store, their guilt too sharp to face. She carried herself like a ghost hair, unbrushed clothes hanging off her shrinking frame. The house itself fell apart in the wake of their sorrow. The front steps sagged dangerously, weeds pushing through the cracked concrete. Madison's swing set in the yard rusted in the wet air, its chains creaking in the wind like a taunt. Denise refused to let anyone help her fix it. She insisted Madison would want to see it waiting for her when she returned. Mail piled up in the entryway until she stopped opening the door altogether. Carl stopped sleeping there at all, choosing to crash on couches in truck stops or cheap motels along the highway. It was as if they could not stand to share the same space anymore, both haunted by their failures. Emily, Madison's best friend, stopped sleeping through the night. She had nightmares about the woods, of seeing Madison's face staring back at her from behind the trees. Her parents took her to counseling, trying to ease the guilt she carried for not pulling her friend back. She cried to them that she had lied about what Madison had said before she disappeared. She had not just waved goodbye. She had whispered she was going to show someone the secret fort they had found in the woods, a hidden clearing with a pile of old lumber. Emily had been too scared to admit it at the time. When detectives heard this, they sent searchers back to that spot, but nothing was found except beer cans and broken boards, the remnants of teenagers using the place to drink. By the second year, the police stopped talking about the case at meetings. New faces joined the force who only knew Madison's name from the old flyers, still taped in the break room. The sheriff felt the weight of it every time he walked past them. He would pause, look at the big brown eyes staring back, and shake his head before moving on. The case remained open, but no one actively worked it. Denise kept calling the department monthly, demanding updates. They would tell her gently they had nothing new. She would hang up with shaking hands sometimes, throwing the phone across the room, where it would clatter against the wall and break. The divorce papers came in the third year. Denise had finally had enough of Carl's absence, of his drunken calls from distant highways, accusing her of forgetting their daughter. He signed the papers without reading them, sitting at a diner counter with a cup of cold coffee watching trucks roar by on the interstate. Denise stayed in the house despite everyone urging her to move. She claimed it was the only place Madison would know to come home to. But the neighborhood had changed. Kids no longer rode bikes past her yard. Their parents steered them to the other side of the street. The house had become a landmark of tragedy, a place children whispered about at sleepovers, daring each other to touch the front door. The town itself tried to move on, but Madison's disappearance left a scar. Meadowbrook Elementary replaced the old fence and added security cameras that actually worked. Teachers got training on watching for warning signs, on documenting strange behavior. The principal retired early, citing stress, but really everyone knew she could not stand the guilt of that day. Every year on the anniversary of Madison's disappearance, someone would tape a single pink flower to the fence. Sometimes it would be Denise. Other times no one knew who had left it. The wind would blow it away within a day, but for a moment it would be there, a stubborn marker that the town had not entirely forgotten. By the 4th year after Madison's disappearance, Denise lived almost entirely alone in the crumbling house that felt like a mausoleum. The windows were thick with grime, and weeds pressed up against the siding in dense clusters. Inside, the air was stale and sour, a mix of unwashed clothes, cold coffee, and the faint floral scent of the fabric softener she used on Madison's bedding that she refused to change. She spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers rubbing the wood smooth in one spot, eyes locked on the front door, as though willing it to open. She still spoke to Madison sometimes, in hushed, pleading tones. She told her daughter she forgave her for running off, that it was not her fault. Neighbors stopped knocking. Even the church volunteers who once brought food quietly left boxes on the porch without ringing the bell. Carl, meanwhile, rarely crossed the Indiana state line anymore. He had taken a series of trucking jobs that kept him on the road for months. He liked the thrum of the big rig's engine beneath his feet, and the endless miles of highway that asked nothing of him. He slept in truck stop parking lots or cheap motels, ignoring the calls from old friends who tried to check in. When he drank, he got mean ranting to other drivers at the counter about how no one had really looked for his girl, how the cops had given up too soon. He would pull out the battered photo he kept in his wallet, the edges soft and curling, and demand strangers look at it, insisting they would remember her. When they shook their heads or backed away, he would slam the photo on the counter and curse them all for cowards. Denise eventually filed for divorce, sending the papers to the trucking company's main office in a manila envelope covered in angry pen marks. Carl signed them without reading them, dropping them in the mail at a gas station in Missouri. When the divorce was finalized, Denise did not tell anyone. She spent that day sitting in Madison's room, tracing the flowered pattern on the curtains with her thumb, whispering that it was all Carl's fault that he should have been there. At night, she would lie in Madison's bed, legs curled tight, listening to the wind push against the rotting siding, telling herself she would wait forever if she had to. They had no savings left. The reward money had gone to waste on dead-end leads, and legal fees ate the rest. Denise stopped paying for repairs around the house. The heat barely worked, the roof leaked in 3 places, and mold climbed the bathroom walls. She did not care. When a social worker showed up unannounced after someone called about the state of the property, Denise met her on the porch, hair wild, eyes bright with rage. She screamed at the woman to leave, waving her arms so hard she nearly fell off the steps. The social worker backed away, muttering about mental health referrals, but nothing ever came of it. The town had quietly agreed to leave Denise alone, considering it a mercy to let her rot in her grief unbothered. Carl sometimes called Denise late at night when he was drunk and lonely, his voice slurred and ugly. He would start by saying he missed her, that he missed their family, then slide into accusations that she had not watched Madison carefully enough. Denise would scream back that he was a coward, that he had abandoned them, that maybe he was the one who did it. These calls always ended in both of them hanging up, breathless, and crying their words, leaving invisible bruises neither could heal. After each call, Carl would sit behind the wheel of his idling truck, staring at the highway in the dead of night, imagining Madison's face looking back at him from every exit sign and roadside billboard. Neighbors still gossiped about them, at the diner and gas station. People shook their heads over how Carl had turned mean and sloppy, how Denise had turned silent and cold. They argued about whose fault it was. Some said it was Denise, who had always been too trusting, who had let Madison wander off. Others insisted Carl had a temper that he could have snapped in a moment of rage. No one dared say these things to their faces. Instead, they offered polite nods when they crossed paths at the grocery store, both of them shopping at odd hours to avoid crowds. Denise often bought nothing but canned soup and discount bread. Carl filled his cart with beer and gas station jerky, paying in crumpled bills with grimy hands. The town of Greenfield felt the strain in other ways, too. Parents were stricter about letting kids roam, and the playground at Meadowbrook Elementary had new rules posted on every gate. Teachers went through annual safety training that focused heavily on what had happened to Madison. But it was not just fear that changed the town. It was shame. Everyone who had searched and failed carried a secret wound. The firehouse still had a corner of its basement stacked with boxes of old flyers, search maps with coffee rings, and unused packs of bottled water. No one could bear to throw them out, but no one wanted to see them either. They sat there gathering dust as silent testimony to failure. Denise clung to hope in the most painful way possible. She refused to move, claiming Madison would never find her if she left. She kept the porch light on every night, even when the bulb burned out, and she had to unscrew it in the dark with shaking fingers. She refused to change her phone number in case Madison remembered it. She left the bedroom window cracked, even in the dead of winter, muttering that her daughter might need to get in if she came home late. When people asked why she tortured herself like this, she glared at them until they walked away. In her mind, she was not torturing herself. She was waiting. By 2009, 8 years after Madison vanished, the old Kramer house sat slumped on its foundation, like it was giving up. The paint had peeled away in wide curls, and the porch boards sagged under the weight of neglect. Weeds tangled in the chain-link fence curling around the rusted gate that barely closed. Denise had left town the year before, finally moving in with a cousin 2 counties away after the bank threatened foreclosure. She left most of Madison's things behind, boxed up in the dusty rooms, as if the girl might return to unpack them herself. The property went to auction quietly, no one wanting to talk much about who would live there next. It was the Rileys who eventually moved in, a young couple with a daughter of their own. They bought the place for almost nothing, deciding the bad history did not scare them if it meant owning a piece of land they could call their own. For months they worked on repairs. They ripped out stained carpet and pried moldy drywall off the bathroom walls. The husband patched the roof himself, balancing on the brittle shingles while his wife held her breath from the yard. Inside, they painted over the peeling walls in bright, clean colors, determined to make it a home where laughter could return. Their daughter Bella, only 4, watched all of it with wide eyes, clutching her stuffed rabbit in one small hand. They tackled the yard next, hacking away the wild grass and hauling broken furniture to the dump. The old swing set came down with a screech of metal that made Bella clap her hands over her ears. They planned to replace it with something new, bright plastic, and safe. The Rileys dug new garden beds, hoping for tomatoes and squash in the summer. They pruned back the hedge that had swallowed the side of the house. Under all that work, the lot began to look less like a haunted place and more like a fresh start. They told themselves that they would not think about the girl who had vanished, that the past was gone, locked away in other people's pain. Bella played in the yard as they worked, dragging her stuffed rabbit through the dirt and talking to herself in elaborate stories. She would wander to the edges of the property, pressing her nose against the fence and staring into the neighbors' yards. Her parents worried a little about her wandering, but they liked seeing her outside instead of in front of the television. They promised themselves to keep an eye on her, but sometimes got distracted with hammers and paint rollers. One afternoon, Bella asked if she could have a sandbox. She had seen one in a friend's yard, a simple wooden frame filled with clean sand where she could bury her toys and dig them back up. The idea seemed harmless. Her father built it himself over a weekend using leftover lumber from the porch repair. He staked out a sunny spot in the backyard close enough to the house to see from the kitchen window. He lined the bottom with plastic sheeting, filled it with pale sand from the garden center, and leveled the corners with a spirit level he borrowed from a neighbor. When he finished, Bella squealed in delight and ran circles around it. She plopped down in the middle rabbit in her lap, shoveling sand with a bright blue plastic spade. Her mother watched from the porch, feeling a brief glow of satisfaction that their daughter was happy here in this yard that had once frightened everyone else. A few weeks later, Bella was playing in the Sandbox on a warm afternoon while her mother did dishes inside. The window over the sink was open, and she could hear her daughter singing nonsense words in that high, off-key voice only small children have. Bella went quiet for a moment, and her mother frowned, wiping her hands on a dish towel and leaning closer to listen. She heard a strange scraping sound, the hollow noise of plastic hitting something solid. Bella let out a little confused grunt and then a shrill call for her mother. The woman hurried out the back door, heart thumping a little harder than she would admit. She asked what was wrong, and Bella pointed at the sand, her bottom lip trembling. In the sandbox, a corner of something dark and crumpled was peeking through the disturbed sand. It looked like old plastic, thick and weathered, wrapped tightly around something lumpy. Bella had been trying to pull it free with her tiny hands, smearing sand across her knees and leaving furrows in the pile. Her mother's first thought was that it was garbage, something left behind by the previous owners. She told Bella to step back and crouch down to inspect it. When she brushed more sand away, a sour smell rose up sharp enough to make her eyes water. She felt her stomach turn cold. Without thinking, she pulled her daughter up and told her to go inside immediately. She called her husband, voice shaking, as she described what she had found. He came running from the side yard, wiping sweat from his forehead with his shirt. They both stood over the sandbox, neither one wanting to touch it again. Finally, he grabbed the shovel leaning against the fence and started digging carefully around the shape. More of the plastic bag came into view, and they could see it was tightly wrapped with layers of tape, the edges brittle with age. He dropped the shovel when something small and white tumbled out between folds of plastic. It rolled onto the sand with a muffled thunk, and they both froze. It was unmistakably a bone far too small to be anything but human. The Riley family did not sleep that night. They sat in their living room with the curtains drawn tight, speaking in low, urgent tones, while Bella dozed on the couch, clutching her stuffed rabbit. The smell from the sandbox still clung to them, even after they had scrubbed their hands raw at the kitchen sink. They had called the sheriff's office as soon as they realized what they were looking at. The dispatcher's voice had gone quiet after they explained, asking them to stay put and not touch anything. Within the hour, 2 squad cars pulled up with their lights flashing, bathing the yard in pulsing red and blue that made the peeling paint on the house seem to shiver. Deputies unrolled crime scene tape around the sandbox while the family huddled inside, watching through the window, their faces pale and tight. Deputy Samuels took the initial statement while crime scene techs snapped photos of the torn plastic and the small white bone lying on top of the sand. They worked with grim efficiency, lifting the brittle layers of plastic to reveal the tangled contents. The smell worsened as they cut it open, making them turn their heads and gag behind gloved hands. Inside, they found the partial remains of a child, the tiny bones jumbled and stained with dark patches where decay had clung for years. There were clumps of hair tangled with the tape, matted and discolored, but unmistakable. One of the techs found a faded pink bracelet among the bones, the beads grimy, but the letters on them still legible enough to read Madison. Sheriff Harris himself arrived not long after stepping carefully over the tape and pulling on gloves with shaking fingers. He had worked this case 8 years ago. He had watched the town turn itself inside out searching for that little girl. Seeing the remains spread out in the sandbox was like being punched in the chest. He stood there for a long time, breathing through his mouth to keep the smell away, remembering the tearful press conferences and the screaming matches between Denise and Carl at the station. He told his deputies to treat the scene with care, to photograph every angle, to document every grain of sand displaced. No one spoke much. The only sounds were the distant whine of cicadas and the click of camera shutters. Back inside the house, the Rileys tried to answer questions between comforting their frightened daughter. Bella could not stop crying, asking over and over if she was in trouble. Her mother wrapped her in a blanket and shushed her, while explaining that she had done nothing wrong, that she had helped the police by finding what was hidden. Bella did not seem convinced. She kept looking toward the window where the red and blue lights flashed like a nightmare. Her father's voice broke as he described finding the bag, how he had stopped digging the moment he saw bone. The deputy wrote it all down with careful strokes, occasionally glancing at the little girl and softening his tone. By dawn the next day, the yard was crawling with crime scene investigators. They had set up tents and floodlights illuminating the sandbox and surrounding dirt like a stage. Neighbors gathered behind the police tape, clutching coffee mugs and murmuring in hushed voices. Some remembered the original search parties years before. They had walked these same yards in lines, eyes on the ground, hoping for any sign. Watching the sheriff carry evidence bags now felt like a cruel joke. The pastor from the local church stood among them, twisting his hat in his hands, whispering prayers under his breath. No one really knew what to say. The remains were collected and sent to the state lab for analysis, though everyone knew who they belonged to. Denise Kramer's old missing posters had mentioned the pink bracelet with beads that spelled out her daughter's name. It was one of the last things she remembered putting on Madison's wrist before school that day. Sheriff Harris made the call himself, reaching Denise through the cousin she had moved in with. The phone call was short and devastating. Denise did not cry on the line. She went silent, instead the kind of silence that made the sheriff close his eyes and lean back in his chair after he hung up. He would have given anything to avoid making that call, but there was no one else to do it. Carl was harder to track down. He was on a route in Arkansas when they found him sitting in a diner parking lot with his rig idling. The deputy who delivered the news said Carl stared at the ground without blinking for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally spoke, his words were slurred from the beer on his breath. He asked if they were sure, if it really was her, if maybe it was some other kid. The deputy said he was sorry, but it was her. Carl nodded once and then vomited on the pavement. He spent the night in his truck, ignoring calls from friends, his phone screen lit up with missed voicemails until the battery died. Back in Greenfield, the discovery reawakened every old wound. The local news ran the story on a loop, showing the faded, missing poster alongside fresh footage of deputies in the Rileys' yard. People who had moved away heard about it through family and called back in horror. The town felt the loss all over again, like a scab ripped from a half-healed cut. School administrators called emergency meetings with parents to discuss how to talk to their children. Some people left flowers at the fence of the old Kramer house, their heads bowed as they set them down. Others lit candles on their porches, watching them gutter in the wind before snuffing them out. After the discovery, Greenfield shifted from shock to grim anticipation as investigators reopened the case. The small sheriff's office buzzed with activity it had not seen in years. Folders that had sat in a dusty cabinet were pulled out and spread across desks under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. Deputies who had been rookies back then now wore sergeant stripes on their sleeves. They traded memories of the original search, sifting through old maps marked with bright highlighter that had long since faded. Sheriff Harris called in help from the state police, who arrived in sleek cars with radios crackling and fresh eyes. They reviewed every statement and photograph, cross-referencing timelines in hopes of spotting what they missed before. The Rileys stayed with family 2 towns over, unwilling to return to the house where their daughter had found the remains. They answered every question patiently, explaining again and again how they had moved in only the year before, how they knew nothing about the Kramer family beyond whispers and old newspaper clippings. Deputies confirmed the closing dates and the title transfers, checking bank records that showed the Rileys had poured every spare cent into fixing up the property. Their innocence was never really in doubt, but the sheriff made sure to clear them publicly to stop any gossip before it started. Even so, Neighbors still glanced at the house with a new kind of dread, the yard behind the crime scene tape, like a wound that refused to close. It was the old property surveys that gave them the first big break. A deputy named Lawson sat cross-legged on the floor in the records office, thumbing through yellowed pages that smelled of mildew. He found a survey from 2000 that showed the fence line running several feet farther out than it did now. The backyard had been larger when the Kramers lived there, and the spot where the Sandbox now sat would have been well within their original property line. He brought the map to Sheriff Harris, pointing out the faded boundary markers with a shaking finger. It meant Madison had been buried on her family's land the entire time, hidden in plain sight while search parties walked within feet of her. Investigators returned to Denise for another interview. She sat stiffly in her cousin's living room, arms crossed over her thin chest hair, pulled back in a severe knot that emphasized the lines on her face. Her eyes were hollow as she answered questions in a monotone. She insisted she never saw anything, never suspected the yard. She described the nights she spent on the porch, crying, calling Madison's name until her voice broke. She told them she had always believed someone had snatched her and driven away. When they showed her the photo of the bracelet recovered from the grave, she closed her eyes for so long they wondered if she had fallen asleep. When she opened them again, they were wet but clear. She said she wanted whoever did it to pay. Carl was harder to reach. Deputies eventually found him at a truck stop outside Cincinnati, slumped over a diner counter with a mug of black coffee. He stank of sweat and diesel fuel, unshaven and bleary-eyed. He listened as they explained the new findings, the old survey, the fact that Madison had been buried in their own yard. He cursed under his breath and refused to make eye contact. He denied knowing anything about it, voice cracking with either rage or despair. He said he had been on the road when she disappeared, showing crumpled receipts from a gas station in Kentucky. But the sheriff's men pointed out the gap in the timeline. There were 2 days he could not account for time enough to return and bury a secret no one was supposed to find. They asked Denise about those days too, and she went pale. She admitted she had not seen Carl during part of that time that they had been fighting so badly they were avoiding each other. She had assumed he was working late, sleeping in his truck somewhere. She covered her face with her hands when she said this, her voice muffled, as she confessed she did not really know. Investigators documented every word, every sigh. They returned to the old evidence logs, pulling up receipts that had been collected years before, but never fully examined. There it was in Carl's name, dated the day after Madison vanished. A purchase at a local hardware store for plastic sheeting and heavy-duty tape. Detectives brought this to Sheriff Harris, who sat with his elbows on his desk for a long time, staring at the blurry printout. He remembered the early interviews, the anger in Carl's voice, the deflection. They had written it off as grief at the time. Now it looked like something else entirely. He ordered his men to get a warrant for DNA samples, hoping the tape or plastic had preserved something useful. The lab worked quickly under pressure, confirming that Carl's DNA was present on the tape edges used to bind the bag. It was not conclusive on its own, but it was another piece in a puzzle that was growing horribly clear. Carl was brought in for formal questioning. He sat at the metal table in the small interrogation room, sweating through his shirt. The sheriff read him his rights with a heavy voice. Carl insisted over and over that he did not kill his daughter, that he did not remember buying the tarp, that receipts did not prove anything. His voice would crack and rise as he insisted he loved Madison, that he would have died for her. But when shown the DNA report, he went silent. His eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. For hours he refused to say another word until finally he dropped his head to the table and began to sob in long, broken gasps that seemed to echo in the quiet hallway outside. Carl's arrest did not come with a dramatic chase or shouting on the street. Deputies found him at a tired little motel outside Indianapolis, a place that rented by the week to truckers and people with nowhere better to go. He was sitting on the bed when they knocked the TV on, but muted. He did not resist when they cuffed him, only winced as the metal bit his wrists. Outside, he blinked against the afternoon sun and squinted at the parking lot as if trying to recognize it. He asked if he could smoke, but they told him no. They loaded him into the cruiser while the manager stood at the door holding a clipboard, shaking his head and muttering about bad luck. The ride back to Greenfield was silent, except for the hum of the tires. Carl stared at his reflection in the security glass eyes rimmed with red. At the station, they booked him photographing his blank expression and rolling his fingers in black ink. He barely looked at the camera. In the interrogation room, he slumped in the hard, metal chair, hands chained to the ring in the table. Sheriff Harris read him his rights, slowly voice level, giving the words the weight they deserved. Carl stared at the table and nodded. He would not speak at first, answering every question with a tight-lipped silence. The detectives laid out the receipts, the DNA evidence, the timeline of his unaccounted days. His shoulders twitched as they spoke, but he said nothing. When they showed him photos of the bracelet found with the bones, the beads spelling out Madison, his lip trembled. Eventually, Carl began to talk in a low, choked voice that forced the detectives to lean forward to hear. He claimed he had never meant for anything to happen. He said Madison was upset that morning, wanting to skip school. They had argued, voices rising in the tiny kitchen until she cried. He described trying to calm her down, promising her ice cream if she would just quiet down. He insisted over and over that he never wanted to hurt her. When pressed on how she died, he would not say. He just shook his head over and over, repeating that it had been an accident. The detectives exchanged looks, writing every word. The story felt incomplete, and everyone in the room knew it. When they asked about the burial, Carl went quiet for almost a full minute. He squeezed his eyes shut and hissed that he had panicked. He said he could not bring himself to drive her away. He had wrapped her in the tarp and dug a hole in the yard in the middle of the night while Denise slept in their room, exhausted from searching the neighborhood earlier that day. He described the scraping of the shovel against the rocky soil, the way he had to stop every few minutes to vomit behind the shed. His voice cracked, describing it, and for a moment the room was silent except for the buzz of the fluorescent light. Sheriff Harris did not say anything, just nodded for him to continue. Carl said he had planned to move her later to find somewhere safer, farther away, but the police were always around. The volunteers were in the yard for days. He said he felt trapped, unable to dig her up without being seen. Eventually he told himself it was over, that maybe if no one found her, they could move on. When asked how he lived with that, he just shrugged weakly. He admitted he drank to forget. He confessed that every night on the road he saw her in the passenger seat, glaring at him in the dark. He did not ask for forgiveness. He just kept talking until his words dissolved into sobs. Word of the confession leaked quickly, spreading through Greenfield like wildfire. The local news sent reporters to the courthouse steps. People who had once offered Carl kind words during the first searches now spat his name like poison. Parents clutched their children closer. Teachers at Meadowbrook Elementary spoke to counselors about how to explain it to their students. The town felt betrayed on a bone-deep level, like it had been tricked into helping hide a murderer in its midst. The playground where Madison had last been seen fell silent for a week, the swings moving in the breeze without children. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers of what had happened. Denise had to be told in person. Sheriff Harris made that drive himself. She sat in her cousin's kitchen, staring at the tabletop, her thin fingers tracing circles in the varnish. When she heard Carl's confession, she did not scream or cry. She just closed her eyes slowly and let out a long, rattling breath. Her cousin tried to put an arm around her, but she shook it off gently. She asked what would happen next in a hollow voice. Harris explained the charges, the likelihood of trial. She nodded and stood up, moving slowly, as though every joint ached. She walked to the window and pressed her hand against the glass, looking at nothing in particular. In the jail cell, Carl refused visitors. His lawyer met with him repeatedly, trying to prepare a defense, but he offered no help. He would only say he did not want to make Denise testify. He talked about taking a plea if it would mean avoiding the death penalty. He mumbled about sparing the town another trial. The lawyer noted everything and tried to coax him to cooperate, but Carl seemed to have deflated entirely. When asked why he had not confessed sooner, he said he did not have the courage. He claimed he believed Madison would stay hidden forever, that Denise could go on believing she was alive somewhere, that it was better than the truth. No one in the room agreed. Carl sat in the county jail for months while lawyers negotiated a plea deal that would keep him from facing the death penalty, but still ensure he would never breathe free air again. The district attorney met with Denise before finalizing the agreement, wanting her approval to avoid the anguish of a public trial. She listened quietly in the conference room of her cousin's house, the blinds drawn against the harsh afternoon light. Her hair was grayer than when she had first pleaded for Madison's return on television, and her face was lined deeply from years of sleepless nights and regret. When they asked what she wanted, she whispered that she wanted it over. She did not want to take the stand and tell strangers about the worst day of her life. She did not want to hear Carl's voice filling the courtroom while reporters scribbled notes. She just wanted it done so she could start forgetting, even if she knew she never truly would. The town of Greenfield learned about the plea deal through the evening news. The anchor spoke carefully, reading from a statement issued by the sheriff's department that confirmed Carl Kramer had admitted responsibility for his daughter's death and accepted life in prison without parole. In living rooms and kitchens, people watched in silence, forks paused midway to mouths, televisions flickering in the gathering dusk. Some felt relief that there would be no drawn-out trial that would reopen wounds too raw to bear. Others felt cheated of the opportunity to see him forced to explain every detail on the witness stand. The playground at Meadowbrook Elementary remained quiet that week, as teachers held special assemblies, reassuring students that they were safe now that the man who had hurt Madison would never return. Denise did not attend the sentencing. She stayed at her cousin's house, curled in the old armchair by the front window, watching the autumn leaves swirl and fall in muted colors of rust and ochre. She listened as the wind rattled the glass and tried to empty her mind. When her cousin asked if she wanted company, she shook her head slowly. She wanted to be alone with her memories for a while. She wanted to remember Madison as she had been on that last morning, hair in neat braids, eyes shining with stubborn defiance, asking to skip school just this once. She tried to focus on that memory instead of the plastic-wrapped bundle uncovered in the sand. She told herself she could choose which memory to carry. The sheriff visited her one final time before closing the case. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in his hands, explaining that the file would now be marked solved, but never closed in his heart. Denise listened without responding, her gaze locked on the middle distance where the road twisted out of sight. He tried to offer comfort, saying that her daughter could finally rest, that the town would never forget what had been done to her. Denise blinked slowly and said she hoped he was right. She did not cry in front of him. She had run out of tears years ago. Instead, she nodded once and thanked him for doing his job. The sheriff left quietly, shoulders stooped as he descended the porch steps. Carl's transport to the state prison happened without fanfare. Deputies led him in handcuffs through the back entrance of the courthouse to avoid the reporters clustered out front. He wore the orange jumpsuit and cheap sandals they issued him, his hair cut short and thinning at the crown. He did not look at the cameras waiting beyond the barriers. He kept his head down the entire time, except for one moment when he glanced at the courthouse facade, and his mouth tightened as though he had bitten through something bitter. The deputies did not speak to him more than necessary. He offered no resistance as they loaded him into the secure van. The ride to the prison was long and quiet, the driver keeping the radio off. In prison, Carl avoided the other inmates as much as possible, spending most of his days in the small library reading dog-eared paperbacks without really absorbing the words. Guards reported that he rarely spoke, except when necessary, responding in monosyllables or not at all. He received no visitors after the first few months, and his letters home went unanswered. The warden noted in his file that he displayed no signs of wanting to appeal his sentence and that he participated in no rehabilitation programs. He simply sat through the years, eyes dull and distant, as though waiting for something that would never come. Greenfield tried to heal, but the scar remained. The playground fence where Madison had slipped through was replaced with solid metal slats impossible to squeeze between. The school held annual assemblies about safety that used to make the younger children cry and the older ones sit stiff and silent. Parents clung to their children at pickup. At church services, prayers were said for lost children everywhere, but everyone knew exactly who they meant. Madison's name was engraved on a small plaque in the town square, beneath a maple tree that blazed red in autumn. People would pause there on their way to work or school, placing flowers or notes written in careful, childlike handwriting. Denise eventually sold the house she had once refused to leave. She used the money to rent a small apartment in a neighboring town where no one recognized her on sight. She found work at a grocery store, bagging produce and stocking shelves. She liked the mindless rhythm of the tasks and the way people thanked her without knowing her story. She kept one photograph of Madison in her bedroom in a simple wooden frame. Some nights she would hold it against her chest and whisper apologies for not protecting her. She still left a porch light on every evening, even though she now lived on the second floor, and no one would see it from the street. The Rileys never returned to the house after the investigation ended. They sold it to a distant buyer through a real estate agent who avoided describing the property in too much detail. It sat vacant for a while, the grass growing long again, the windows gathering dust. Eventually, another family moved in, repainting the siding, planting flowers in the front yard, and replacing the broken swing set with a new one in bright primary colors. Their children laughed as they played, unaware of the history beneath their feet. The town tried not to talk about it, except in hushed tones at night, when the wind rattled the fences and the old fear stirred again. People learned to live with the truth even if they never forgave it. They held their children closer when they said goodbye in the morning. They locked their doors carefully at night. They spoke more kindly to one another in line at the post office or while picking up milk. They remembered that monsters were not always strangers lurking at the edge of the woods, but could be the person sitting at the dinner table. In that hard lesson, Greenfield found a grim kind of unity, a promise to watch out for every child as though they were their own. Madison's name remained on their lips, not as a ghost to frighten children, but as a reminder of what they refused to forget. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear what you think about the plot and where you are watching from. Share your thoughts in the comments below and join the conversation. Your support helps us bring more stories to life.